Welcome to the Honest Mamas podcast, where we talk about the emotional and spiritual aspects of the motherhood journey. We are a team of honest mamas. Myself, Melissa, Sophie, and Claire. We are psychotherapists, moms, and friends. Join us as we get real about the topics that matter to you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 47 of the Honest Mamas podcast. This is Melissa, and today I had the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Shelly Steinwurtzel about the NICU Neonatal Intensive Care Unit Experience. Shelley is a New York State licensed clinical psychologist who is currently working not only in private practice, but also as an assistant professor of clinical medical psychology at Columbia University. She works in the Neonatal Intensive Care Unit and consults in the Anita Comfort Palliative Care Program. She's absolutely instrumental in helping parents and family members as they navigate the joys and traumas of having a baby born early or even with medical complications. Her work is incredible and is instrumental to helping families navigate this challenging time. I am hoping that today's conversation will help those that are listening that need more support and that find themselves perhaps in the NICU. Here's my conversation with Dr. Shelly Steinwurtzel. Shelley, I'm so excited that we were able to make this work today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So I first met Shelley in book club, which was a great introduction. And then she was able to take me into the Morgan Stanley Children's Hospital in New York City so that I could get kind of a little bit of a flavor of what she does day to day. And I was absolutely blown away by the work that you offer to not only the parents in the NICU, but also the staff. And I thought we could just start with kind of what got you on this journey? What got you interested in helping and supporting families and staff in the NICU?
So I never imagined working in a NICU setting. I always thought I'd be working with adults with mental illnesses. And then I got pregnant during grad school, and I ended up having my first daughter a little early. And it really was a very profound and sort of traumatic experience. And it took me a while to realize the impact of having been in the NICU and having had a traumatic labor and delivery experience. And then I went on and continued with my graduate training, and then had a second child 4 years later and was in the NICU again. And it was a completely different experience for me because of the psychological work I had done with a therapist. And it made me realize, as I was sitting there one day holding my second daughter next to her little isolette, that maybe I was brought here for a second time for a reason, and maybe my professional and personal experience was coming together in a very specific way. And so after I got my license, I sought out opportunities, and there really are not very many psychologists in NICUs around the country, but there were two psychologists, Sina Steinberg and Susan Kramer, who are part-time in the NICU at Columbia, and they happened to be looking for a fellow for right around the time when I started looking into this experience as a profession. So that's what happened. I started working with them. They supervised me, and then I've since taken over in the NICU.
That's amazing. So amazing. And I bet what makes you, well, I've seen it firsthand. What makes you so amazing at what you do is because you do have the personal experience, not with only one child, but with two children. That's intense.
Yeah, it was intense. And I do think that I utilize my personal experience. I try to be very thoughtful about where the professional and the personal come together and how to utilize the personal experience effectively so that it's for the parents and not for me.
And so with that said, just for, moms that are listening that maybe are having their baby in the NICU or maybe don't know yet and possibly are afraid of that, or someone, there is a medical issue that perhaps they've been alerted to that they will have to go in the NICU. Before we work on kind of talking about how to support them, what did you notice in your difference between the first time that you were in the NICU and then once you got some more support, processed some of this material. What did you notice the second time?
Well, I think what was so scary about the first time was that you really lose all sense of control, or much of the control that you thought you might have. And I think pregnancy and becoming a parent is a lot about, you're entering entirely new terrain. So there's a way that you feel out of control to begin with. But when you're in the NICU, you're not parenting in the way that you maybe anticipated. It's not going the way you thought it would go or should go. And you have to rely on these other people, and your parental identity development is significantly affected by sharing the responsibility of parenting and caretaking. And I felt like I had done something wrong. There's a lot of guilt and shame, I think, that comes with the NICU experience, because parents often will talk about how they feel that what if I didn't have that hot dog, or what if I could have done something differently, and you feel very guilty, and then on top of it, you get to your baby's out in the world, and there's not much that you can do. So that was I think a big thing for me in my first experience. And by the second time, I think it was actually very helpful that I knew what it meant to be a parent, and I knew that the NICU experience was just a small part of my parenting experience. And so by the second time, I had also figured out, like, what were some of the things that made me uniquely special to my baby, and what were some of the things that I could do in the NICU. And I also knew that I couldn't do it alone. And I was okay. I had learned how to depend on others for help and support in a way that was really hard for me the first go round.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And I'm also imagining that it is so case by case specific, just hearing some of the stories that landed, a lot of these families' babies in the NICU were so varied, whether they knew about it or not, or whether it was unplanned or not. And I think that can also play into a lot, I'm imagining, of how, women particularly, because a lot of women are listening to this, how they kind of process it, digest it, and really navigate through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think if you know that you're going to be in the NICU, don't put a timeline on it. I think that it's really important to, even if there is a timeline that people have told you, be really flexible with that thinking, because it can be very disappointing if it doesn't meet your expectations. And I think figuring out in advance, who's going to help with what, how are we going to disseminate information, choosing one good friend or sibling to tell the information and then have them share it with a larger group, or setting up a closed Facebook page. That's what some of our families do. The caringbridge.org is a good source for not being bombarded by other people's questions that can feel very re-traumatizing for a lot of people and overwhelming. And so for some parents, setting up a food train, having one friend set up a food train and then having meals dropped off, or getting somebody to volunteer to walk your dog every day. These are like the little things that really make a difference, because they create a sense of being supported by people who love you, and then you can focus your energy on your baby.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so for the women that are there and they can do those more practical things, number one, I think it is a lot about really being able to take the help that either people offer or be able to ask.
Mm-hmm.
And then also kind of how do you suggest women that are there that are really navigating all of this for the first time, how do they seek out some emotional support, because they're feeling a lot?
Mm-hmm. So most, if not all, NICUs are going to have a social worker. And if you haven't met with the social worker, you can always ask to meet with the social worker. I think other parents can be a great support. I often hear from our alumni parents that it was really helpful that they made one or two close friends in the NICU. Sometimes it could be a double-edged sword, because you can't help but start comparing where your child is versus where their child is. But I'll often hear people say, nobody really understands what it's like unless they've been in the NICU. And so So I think that there is something to be said for just somebody knowing what it feels like to sit hours on end at your baby's bedside and not really knowing how to do what you feel you'd like to do. So that's helpful. If there are groups in the NICU, then certainly attend those. Often there are breastfeeding groups that are specifically for NICU families, and those can be a great support. Sometimes I know, like in our NICU, we have a crocheting group, and parents sit around and learn how to crochet, and there's something meditative about that. Sometimes there are other support groups, psychological support groups, psychoeducational groups. Some places have groups for dads, though those are harder to find sometimes. You can also ask to speak with either a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and you can get a referral to an outpatient clinic. Occasionally, consultants will be brought into the NICU for parents who need a little extra support. And then there's the whole online world, which you sort of have to navigate carefully.
Yes, agreed. Totally. I think what's also important to name, which I know you're going to agree with me, is that some, in the one time that I came with you to the hospital, what I noticed was that it's so powerful sometimes if a parent is not really, they're exhausted, they're emotionally completely overwhelmed. And sometimes even just showing up to a group and maybe not necessarily feeling like you have to talk a whole bunch or, just to show up and maybe hear somebody else's story can also alleviate some of the shame and the feelings of aloneness. So just to remind parents about that also.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Melissa. I often will tell parents when I meet with them individually that if they seem a little introverted or reticent about the group, I'll say, you can totally just come and observe or listen, and feel free to say as much or as little as you like. And if you feel like you need to leave, you can leave. There's no, you can come late. It's entirely up to you because the group is entirely for you. And if it's not serving you, then it's not the right thing for you to do in that moment.
Okay. And so for the women that are listening, what do you notice as a parent being in the NICU, going through this firsthand, and then also seeing hundreds and hundreds of parents go through this? For women specifically, what do you notice emotionally about them at this time when their baby's going to the NICU? I can imagine what it might be, but just to hear, and maybe for others that are listening into this to feel less alone, that their experience is a little bit more normal, would be great to hear about.
Yeah. I think that it's really important to keep in mind the first 2 weeks and the correspondence with the baby blues. So, if you don't know what the baby blues are, it's, up to 80% of new moms who've just delivered experience the baby blues. And that's, a lot of fluctuation in emotion, tearfulness and joy, and everything sort of mixed together. Moms often talk about feeling really like out of control of their emotions. And if you imagine that on top of a traumatic pregnancy, birth experience, or just landing in the NICU. So it's obviously a traumatic event. A traumatic event is the experience of worrying, a real or perceived threat to your life or the life of a loved one, which is exactly what happens in the NICU. And so you have to keep in mind that the trauma plus the baby blues, the first 2 weeks can be incredibly difficult. And then there's often an experience of relief after those first 2 weeks, although it's still very much a roller coaster. Parents often say, I feel like I'm on a roller coaster. And it's like the worst roller coaster you've ever been on because there's no getting off. Like you just have to wait until you get home. And then there's another version that happens after you get home, of course.
Yes.
So I think those first 2 weeks are really tough. There's a roller coaster. A lot of it depends on just trying to take it one day at a time, 1 hour at a time. You have to expect that you're going to be sort of all over the map. Partners often experience the NICU quite differently. So you'll have moms often are very emotive, and I'll have a lot of moms say that their partners are telling them it's going to be fine, it's totally fine, and their partners won't tell them that they're crying in private or very anxious, but they're trying really hard to be strong and support them.
Yeah.
So if there's a way to open the lines of communication so that you don't feel so alone in it, that's quite helpful. I think that I will say that part of what mothers in particular, what I see is it's hard for moms to allow themselves time to take care of themselves.
Huge, Shelley. I'm sure they just don't want to leave.
Yeah, they often don't want to leave. And I get it because I didn't want to leave either, but it's really important to try to find ways to rest and to eat well, go for little walks, do the little things. For some parents, it's really helpful to create crafts for their babies. I'm not an arts and crafts person, but I do see that it can become very meditative and it feels like they're doing something for their babies, which is really, it's a way that they can give themselves permission to do something nice. And I think it also allows them a small opportunity to feel like that they have a normal experience. Mm-hmm. It creates a sense of normalcy in a time that feels very abnormal. So that's good. Journaling, I find to be very helpful. One thing that I do recommend to parents is get yourself a journal, maybe even two, and have one that's for all of the medical stuff and another that's about your experience. I think those are good tools. There's some good apps. Yeah.
There's some good apps on the phone that you can keep track of all the different medical information.
There's an app called My Preemie, and I really like it because it's visually very pleasing. Like it feels like you're creating a baby book for your baby, and it also it cues you into specific questions about how you're doing, and it indicates today's milestones or progress and setbacks. It also has a way to denote what you're feeling today through various pictures, like cloudy or smiley, or so it's really very simple because it has like a glossary of terms. It has a place to jot down questions for your medical team. So I just think, it's really great. I think there's a free version and possibly an upgradable version. And it's created by the Grams Foundation along with three women who wrote a book. Essentially, it's like the essential guide to preemies. And they were both preemie parents who then decided that there wasn't a good enough resource out there for people going through the NICU experience. So I really like that one. There are many others, but that's one that I've used and my parents in the NICU have used and liked.
Great. We'll put that in the show notes so that you don't have to remember that writing down. You can just go look at our show notes for this episode, and all this great information will be in there. I want to circle back just for a moment, also just to maybe flush out a little bit more some of the emotional aspects that a woman in the NICU that you've kind of seen as the professional that you've noticed that, they might be feeling or experiencing.
Yeah. What I've had people describe to me when they've been in the NICU is this experience of crying a lot, but trying to keep it at home. So they'll do a lot of crying and worrying at home, and then they'll get to the NICU, and they've literally described this experience of like, well, I've got to zip it up, and as the elevator rides from the lobby to the floor, I'm just sort of holding my breath and hoping that I don't get bad news as soon as I get there. But I'm also working really hard to present a certain way, which is put together and doing okay, and I've got this under control. And so that's always striking to me. There's a way that they've got this dual experience. And I think the experience in the elevator really speaks to the worry and the trauma, the traumatization of not knowing what to expect next. Feeling, I mentioned feeling out of control before, but I think that's a big thing that happens. And parents also describe obviously not sleeping very well. Part of that is breastfeeding and pumping. Part of it is anxiety. So they'll describe either not being able to fall asleep or falling asleep, but then jumping up with anxiety and needing to call the NICU. Usually in NICUs, I know for sure, certainly in our NICU, parents are welcome to call whenever to just check in on their babies. We have a 24-hour visitation policy. And then some of the other things, people will describe having like reliving of the traumatic event, whether it's when their water broke or when they saw their baby for the first time or not seeing their baby for the first time. In terms of moms who end up in the NICU or expect to end up in the NICU, often they won't necessarily be able to see their baby or feel their baby right away. The baby will often be whisked away, which is extremely difficult to have that experience because you just want to know that your baby's okay. And that's really hard. So I just mentioned that as a preparation and for anybody who ends up in this situation, but that it also can, I think the other feeling that people don't necessarily want to name is grief. There's a tremendous amount of loss and ambiguous loss because you're like, well, my baby's here, but I have lost so much. I've lost the full expectations of a pregnancy. I've lost a healthy pregnancy. For many of our women, they've lost the experience of getting pregnant without some kind of assistance or assistive technologies. And so the loss is broad and deep because it often comes at many stages through the process. And then the NICU becomes another loss. It becomes a loss of holding your baby after delivering. It becomes a loss of the expected labor and delivery process. It can become a loss of the early months. And so I think that the grief and mourning often, are things that people don't like talking about because it packs a really deep punch, but it's really relevant. And I think once we name it, then we can start grieving and processing. So I think that's a big thing. The other thing that I will mention is that there's a lot of effort at positivity in the NICU, and I'm all for gratitude and positivity because we know the effects that it has on the brain. But I think it shouldn't come at the cost of having real deep feelings and acknowledging the validity of the many deep, and as one dad mentioned, his dark place, right? Mm-hmm. Going to the dark place and then creating boundaries around how long you'll let yourself sit there, mm-hmm. but going there and allowing the opportunity to feel what you're feeling so that then you can begin to appreciate some of the beautiful aspects, right? It's a very bittersweet experience, and allowing it to be both bitter and sweet is important.
I think what I'm so struck by as you share this, number one, I get continual chills all over my body because I think you're just naming so rightfully and truthfully the experience of a lot of these women mm-hmm. and families. And what I'm really struck by is the dance between really being strong and being there for your little one, and then also falling apart and mm-hmm. allowing yourself to do that. And then that also being allowed for your partner who is also mm-hmm. struggling in same and different ways. Mm-hmm. And with that kind of dichotomy also comes the question for me, on our podcast, we talk a lot to women about advocating for themselves and for their child, whether unborn or born. And I'm curious from your perspective, how do they handle being able to be an advocate for their child? But what happens if there's like a nurse that they're not connecting with, or they feel like they're so out of control, and maybe it's the anxiety that's pushing them to want to advocate in a way that's not beneficial? I'm sure you see that a lot.
That's a really good observation and thought. Yes. So to your first point, parents should absolutely work as partners with their nursing team and their medical team. And it's hard because, even if you have consistency in nursing, you're automatically going to have at least, 2-day nurses, 3-day nurses, and 3-night nurses over the course of any given week, because you can only have so many people working, at a time. So you're going to have variation in your nursing staff and your doctors. The way that attending physicians work is they'll be on service for a certain number of weeks, and then you'll have fellows, and there are all these other people. And so it can feel really overwhelming. And so we know that as people become more overwhelmed, often what they try to do is exert control, especially if that's your natural coping mechanism. So we do see that for some people, the more anxious they become and the more scared they are, the more they try to control. And that's okay. It's just very important to remind yourself to take a few deep breaths and step back and try to develop a conversation. I think nobody wants to be told what to do or how to do their jobs, but these are your children, and you should certainly be comfortable speaking with the team of medical practitioners and sharing your opinion. I mean, if a parent is at the bedside daily or almost daily and really knows their baby, they learn the baby's likes and dislikes, and certainly those are pieces of information that should be shared and are important to the care of the baby. Medical stuff, you have to be careful and you have to step back. And I think that not step back completely, but ask questions, learn as much as you can, be part of a conversation rather than setting demands. Because it's really important to have a good relationship with your baby's care team, because it always works more smoothly. And I do encourage parents to speak up. It's very important to advocate, but to speak up in a way that it's like the golden rule: treat others the way you would want to be treated, right? Mm-hmm. So treat your medical team the way you would want them to treat you. And if they're not treating you the way that you feel you want to be treated, there's always recourse. You can always, if you're assertive enough, people are able to do this. You could always say, I really appreciate all that you're doing for my baby, but can you, is it possible for us to talk nicely to each other? That's really hard to do, right? Mm-hmm. And if that's too hard, which often it is, there's usually a charge nurse with whom you can speak, or you can ask your social worker to help you out. If there's a psychologist, you can ask your psychologist to help you out. And in reality, you can probably ask anyone who you've forged a good relationship with, because people are in the NICU because they love the work and they love the babies, and they really want to see babies thrive, in addition to surviving. And most practitioners are clear that the mom and dad and family are the ones who take these babies home. And so they need to feel empowered. The family members need to feel empowered to do a good job taking their babies home.
That's such a good point, because I'm thinking, you work at an amazing, well-renowned hospital, but for those other people that are in smaller towns, and maybe it is not such a great relationship with their care team, but maybe it's also not, they're starting to question, is this really the best medical advice? Is this, am I at the right hospital? It can be like that also. So I think mm-hmm. what you're naming is just really being able to trust yourself that your baby mm-hmm. and you're probably there a lot, and you're picking up on things, and you're their parent, and also to be able to have a conversation and stay open-minded as much as you can to try to figure out the best course of care.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is, if you do want a second opinion, if your baby has a complicated medical course or has a complicated medical diagnosis, you can always ask for a second opinion, and you can always ask your team and say to that, you can say, hey, listen, I really appreciate all that. Again, say it nicely. I appreciate all that you're doing, and I appreciate your expertise. I feel like I need to do some more due diligence. Would you, if I reach out to another hospital, can you send my baby's medical records, or can you talk to the chief or the medical director there and see if they have any other ideas? Or, it's not because yes, I guess it's not necessarily that I'm questioning your capabilities. I just don't want to regret anything. I don't want to feel guilty in the future if anything happens. I want to know that I've done everything I can for my child.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, like it's, because the reality is every medical establishment, they all do things somewhat differently. And you'll see that to be true between doctors within the same institution, between nurses within the same institution. That's just human variability. And, science is, we know a lot and we don't know a lot. And at the end of the day, each baby is an individual, and we have to work very carefully, to tend to each individual's needs. And that varies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for naming that, because I think also for a lot of sleep deprived, potentially traumatized, emotional, hormonal women that are listening to this, just even spelling it out like this is what you could say is very, very helpful and very practical. The last thing I want to ask you, Shelley, is around taking your baby home. And I guess the part that I didn't think about until I came to visit you that evening was around, so much, again, this dichotomy, so much relief in leaving and so much fear. Like you had named, or maybe we had talked about it a little bit, in a conversation we had, that, a lot of the nurses are caring for a lot of these babies. And so some parents may feel like, do I even know how to do that? And so maybe if you could just speak to that transition, just really briefly, about what it's like to actually leave the NICU and how some moms might be feeling about that.
So we often talk about discharge as the second crisis in the NICU because, and of course, there are often other crises in between landing in the NICU and being discharged from the NICU. But it really can feel like a crisis because you feel very excited. And then there's, again, often guilt about feeling scared. And it's totally normal. It's totally normal to feel scared about taking your baby home, especially after having a course in the NICU, because you haven't really learned how to take care of your baby on your own. And I think that it's really important to ask as many questions as you can. Anything you feel uncertain of, ask. Keep a running list of questions to ask before discharge. And do as many of the classes as they'll offer. Make sure you practice CPR on one of the dolls that they have, not just watching it. These are really practical things that can help you feel more comfortable about, emergencies and stuff like that. When you're in the NICU, I would recommend doing as many things as possible. So definitely changing diapers and taking temperatures, learning how to swaddle, changing your baby's clothes. If you're taking your baby home with any kind of medical equipment like a nasal gastric tube, practice dropping the tube before your baby comes home. Ask to practice as many times as possible. There are often dolls that have those tubes for practicing. Give a bath. Make sure that you're present for at least one bath when your baby's in the NICU, but try to be there for more if you can be there for more. And the other piece, emotionally and intellectually, I want parents to realize that they are not alone in their worry and their fear, and it's okay to ask for help. And it could mean professional help. It could mean asking a friend or parent or family member to be present for the first couple of baths or for the first couple of days. Asking for help is okay, both for the practical and the emotional. I think it can be really hard to come home from the NICU and go to support groups that are geared towards moms, but not necessarily moms who've had a difficult birthing experience, because the NICU experience is so different. So if you go to, if they go to a support group, as a parent, listen to yourself. Like Melissa said, your intuition is an incredibly strong indicator of what you need. And whatever you're feeling, it's okay. And if you're feeling sad or scared, or, for some parents, they might feel like they want to hurt themselves or run away or do anything, that is out of their norm. What I will say is those are signals. It doesn't make you a bad parent. It just means that there's something that you need help with, and to find that appropriate help. Find a professional who knows how to help you through those experiences. And you had mentioned something earlier, Melissa, that, there's this dance between trying to feel strong and falling apart. And what I often try to reiterate to parents is that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is allow yourself to confront the feelings you're having and confront the thoughts that you're having. So in fact, being strong sometimes means allowing yourself to cry, allowing yourself to articulate your biggest fears. Now, I would say to do it with somebody who can tolerate it. And sometimes that, I have found that often does mean somebody who's trained in dealing with these strong, difficult feelings. Having somebody who provides you with a safe physical and emotional space can be really important. But we know that we can help, that there is help. And sometimes it takes a team of people to help. And sometimes it takes one person to help. But it's important to really trust, as a parent, as a mother, as a woman, as a human being, trust that what you're feeling is neither bad nor good. It just is. And it's a signal that you need support, or that something isn't quite right, and that you can feel better than you're feeling. You just might need someone to walk that path with you.
Absolutely. Well, Shelley, all of this has been tremendously helpful. I think it's going to help a lot of women that are either heading for the NICU, in the NICU, or have been in the NICU. And so for anyone, I know you have an office in Westchester, New York. I think you are tremendous at what you do. And I would send any mother that has had this experience your way to see you. So how can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more about you?
Currently, the best way to reach me is you can email me at Dr. Shelly Steinwurtzel at gmail.com.
Perfect. And we'll put that in the show notes. So again, you don't have to take notes on this. It'll all be there for you. Thank you again, Shelley, so much for being here. I so appreciate your wisdom and your compassion and your knowledge and your firsthand experience.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us in today's conversation with Shelley about the NICU experience. I'm hoping that today's conversation allowed you to feel more support and gave you more information and hopefully some more hope. If you haven't yet gone to our Facebook page, please do so by going to www.facebook.com/Honest Mamas Community, where these conversations and way more will continue.